There it is. Starting now.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Pearson's Speaking About Pedagogy and Practice in English Featured Speakers series. I'm Amy Berger, the Executive Manager for Pearson's English Initiatives and Partnership Programs. I'm glad you could join us today, and I hope you'll find the ideas presented by our speaker valuable for your teaching. For those who are new to the webinar format, I have a few quick reminders before the session begins. If you're calling in by phone, please know that this is not a toll-free number. For that reason, we recommend that you select Use Mic and Speakers so you can listen toll-free through your computer speakers. You may notice that your line has been muted. This is to minimize ambient noise as well as interruptions for our speaker. We encourage you to ask questions using the box marked Questions on the right-hand side of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the presentation, and when the formal presentation is over, I'll use the remaining time to pose as many of your questions as possible to our speaker. If you want to keep up with the conversation on Twitter, follow @PearsonNorthAM and use hashtag PearsonLearn. Okay, so let's get started. Today's session is called Using Cultural Contexts to Make Old Literature Come Alive, Sample Approaches, Assignments, and Materials. And our speaker is Dr. Cheryl Nixon. Cheryl is an Associate Professor and Chair of English at UMass Boston. She teaches graduate-level teaching of literature courses and works with a staff of teaching interns to design and deliver general education literature courses. Her courses often feature interactive exercises that use cultural materials to spark curiosity in her students. Her research focuses on literary and legal representations of the family, and her recent works include The Orphan in 18th Century Law and Literature, Estate, Blood, and Body, as well as Novel Definitions, an anthology of commentary on the novel 1688 to 1815. In this session, Cheryl addresses an important question. How can we encourage our students to become interested in literature they often consider old and dusty? She will explore ways of engaging students in forms of creative inquiry featuring cultural materials. Sample materials and exercises will be shown for each approach. The goal is to foster a new curiosity about the literary text, encouraging students to develop their skills of close reading and interpretation. These materials can also allow students to experience research as an idea-generating process. Student work can make a strange old text become familiar, or can emphasize just how strange that text and its time period are. The use of historical and cultural materials can not only increase a student's understanding of the literary text, but can make the classroom a space characterized by shared investigation, shared knowledge, creation, and fun. These materials, Cheryl's PowerPoint, as well as a recording of today's webinar, will be posted on Pedagogy and Practice. So if this is of interest to you, and you'll notice that Cheryl's giving a lot of great information and sample assignments, that PowerPoint will be available to you in about a week. So Cheryl, are you ready to get started?
I am.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for that great introduction, which actually gives a great overview of the type of things that I will be talking about. So I'm just getting up my materials here, and I think I'm hoping now you can see the slideshow, and I'll go ahead and start clicking through my slides. So thank you all also in the audience. I know this is a little bit of a different type of format and that we can't really talk back and forth, but I'm hoping that the types of materials I present to you trigger lots of thinking on your own part, that we can work back and forth a bit during a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. So as Amy was saying, my presentation is going to be emphasizing what we typically think of as the older literature. And again, in our students' mind, I think anything that's pre-21st century is considered old literature. But really, I'll be looking at some classics from Chaucer and Shakespeare all the way up through Gwendolyn Brooks. Hoping to talk a bit about some of the exercises that I've used really successfully to get students to approach this material with that new type of curiosity that Amy was emphasizing in her intro. What you'll see that I'll do through the presentation is I'll start off by showing you some of my philosophical underpinnings for this type of work, And then I'm going to give you lots of exercises, lots of sort of specific examples that I'll move through fairly quickly because you'll see them kind of at a glance, and then we can always come back to them during Q&A if wanted. These materials are really meant to work at all levels, from an upper level type class, even a graduate level class, and I've used them all the way with freshman students also. So hopefully you'll find something that resonates with you and that you can imagine using in one of your own classes. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with an example. I'm just going to read this out loud, and I want you to imagine being a student where you're just getting this handed to you in class, very cold, with no preparation, no background information whatsoever. Now, you yourself might recognize this right away, but I'm sort of assuming that the student will not know what this material is at all. So here's just sort of a quick little excerpt of literature, maybe a Xerox right out of the Longman Anthology that I'm handing to them. And I'll just read this really quickly. Now, at the beginning of September, the plague raging in a dreadful manner, and the number of burials in our parish increasing more than was ever buried in any parish about London of no larger extent, they ordered this dreadful gulf to be dug, for such as it was, rather than a pit. I got admittance into the churchyard. I saw a man go to and again, going to and fro, as if he was in great agony. He said nothing as he walked about, but 2 or 3 times he groaned very deeply and loud and sighed as he would break his heart. When the buriers came up to him, they soon found he was neither a person infected or desperate, but one oppressed with a dreadful weight of grief indeed, having his wife and several of his children all in the cart that was just come in with him, and he followed in an agony and excess of sorrow. He mourned heartily, as it was easy to see, but with a kind of masculine grief that could alone not give itself vent by tears, and calmly desiring the buriers to let him alone, said he would only see the bodies throw in and go away. But no sooner was the cart turned round and the bodies shot into the pit promiscuously, which was a surprise to him. I say no sooner did he see the sight, but he cried aloud, unable to contain himself. I could not hear what he said, but he went backwards 2 or 3 steps and fell down in a swoon. Okay, so I want you to imagine if you were a student receiving this, and I just said to you, what is this text? What is it about? I'm not going to give you the title. I'm not going to give you the author. I'm not going to give you any information about it. Students, let's just pretend that you have stumbled upon this in a library, and it's up to you to figure out what it is. So I think right away, students would very quickly have some ways that they could start to be doing some searching. So let's sort of imagine a process of exploration and discovery that they might start themselves. And I'm imagining, small groups or pairs of students just being able to dive in and start asking questions. So you can see what I've outlined on this slide. Just obviously they'd start to say, what is this text about? How can we start to figure it out? It obviously mentions London if they go back. It mentions the plague right in the first line or so. It's this sort of prose text, almost a reportage type writing. Then I think a little more close reading, and they'd very quickly be able to remember that there's something going on with some bodies being thrown into a pit, that very harrowing image, and then a man who's feeling grief. So I think very quickly students will start to try to make sense of this, even if they don't know what this text is. I would say then, send them home for homework and say, see if you can figure out what this text is and start doing some more research on it. If you're lucky enough to be in a computer classroom or have a laptop that you can plug in and do some quick keyword searching with them in class, I think very quickly, just based on those keywords, they would easily find that this is Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. And based on that, you can start to ask them, what would we like to know more about this text? What is the type of information we would want to flesh out about this text and about this idea of a plague in London? and encourage them to start a very open-ended research process. So let's sort of look at the type of things that turns up with very, very quick searching on the internet. Very quickly, if they type in just the word plague, London, right away they start to turn up the Great Plague of 1665, which is indeed the plague that Defoe is writing about. And you can see some information that I pulled up from the Museum of London, and I just put it down in a few bullets, where they can find very quickly it's the bubonic plague, 60 to 80% of people who catch it die, some of the symptoms, the idea of the swellings that happen in armpits and groin, the idea that 100,000 Londoners died. They can very quickly find images of the plague. This itself is an image that comes right out of the Longman anthology, and by typing it up online, you can find many copies of it, and one is in the Guildhall Library website. So this is the type of material that I would say students can find very quickly, and it's very high quality. I would encourage you to think of maybe a classroom exercise where students are told, this is a mystery. This text, I'm not going to tell you what it's about, but you can start to ask smart questions about it that will lead you to high-quality answers. So again, if you're imagining them working in pairs, they could start to say, what is this plague? How did this plague spread? How many people in London died? And here you can even see they can find an image of people being buried as a result of the plague. With a little more research, again, this can be done very quickly in only a few minutes. They can start to pull up even better primary sources that start to flesh out the ideas of how was the plague worked with in the sort of cultural context of the late 17th century. And here's a bill of mortality that you can find at the Museum of London website. And you can see, if you look over in the right-hand column, down a few points, you can see the plague is listed as one of the causes of death, and there's 7,165 people dying of the plague compared to far fewer numbers dying of anything else. You can see the spotted fever. Later down on that list, students always love the idea that people die of teeth. If you see the word teeth, they always wonder what that is. Dental decay can lead to death. So the students can, again, find high-quality materials. This is a primary source listing the number of people dying in London in a week. They can find the Diary of Samuel Pepys very quickly if they're searching around using this keyword strategy of plague in 1665. Here are some excerpts, and I'll just mention that these very excerpts appear in the Longman anthology also. So this is readily accessible material. With a little bit more exploration, again, these are just using those keywords and they're turning up in a quick search. Students will likely find Harvard University has an entire website on contagion and devotes a whole page to the Great Plague of London. And you can see that I've put down the website. I've given you a little screenshot of what the opening web page looks like. And then at the bottom of this page, you can see the types of materials that you can easily click on through Harvard and see. You can find these primary sources that have been scanned by Harvard. Now, these are the types of sources that only a few years ago, really 5 years ago, you would have had to go to Harvard, sit in their rare books room, call these things up, and wait for them to be brought to you, read them very carefully, and return them at the end of your day. Now, students can get these right on their desktop. They can print them out. They can share them in class. They can get high-quality primary resources right at their fingertips. So I think what I'm trying to show with this opening example is that students can very quickly move from a complete absence of knowledge about a literary text to a very deep and sort of rich contextualization of that text, using their comfortableness with the internet. We all know that students are very comfortable entering in keyword searches, typing around and calling up materials. What I would like to say is that I think we could use those skills and that familiarity that students have with the internet, but push them to find high-quality materials that can hopefully lead them back to literary sources, especially those old and dusty sources, with newfound enthusiasm. I mean, I think if a student is thinking about a text from the 1660s, they might never think, oh, it's about the plague and people dying and people being shot into a pit. And oh my goodness, that's crazy, that's exciting. And then looking on the internet, they can find sources like the ones right here in front of us, God's terrible voice in the city, or advice for the poor by way of cure and caution, the types of materials that were being circulated at the time of the plague. I think that what we can do with our students is simply encourage them or limit them to finding only materials that are put up on the internet by things like museums and by institutions like museums and universities. And then they will find this high-quality material with quick keyword searches. So let's hope that when students return to the literary text, having done some of this very quick research, and I'll put research sort of in quotation marks, but this quick searching out of contemporary material, hopefully they'll come back to the text with some new enthusiasm and say, okay, I figured out this has to be the Journal of the Plague Year. This must be by Daniel Defoe, and I actually know a little something about the time period, and I know a little something about the plague. Hopefully they'll come back with some new enthusiasm, some new insight into the cultural context, and even what I would say is triggering some new interest in literature's role in shaping that cultural moment, the role that literature plays in kind of recording, reflecting on, creating this cultural context. Hopefully they'll even come in to have a new appreciation for the way that literature uses language and form very specifically to transform those historical events. I can imagine a great conversation about Daniel Defoe's writing style and how he uses narrative sort of right at the birth of the novel, the sort of beginning of prose fiction gaining a popular audience, how he uses prose to capture his audience and really make them feel as though they're witnessing the plague, that they're feeling for this man and his grief, and they're feeling for him as he watches his family being shot into a pit. So hopefully they would come away with a new appreciation for the role that literature plays in shaping these events. Of course, Daniel Defoe wrote Journal of the Plague Year after the plague took place, and it's a bit of a fictionalization and historical reconstruction of those events. And so again, that hopefully would even trigger some interest on the part of students once they got to know a bit more about him and the text. And again, as this one short example has shown, I'm hoping you can see that this type of work can lead to a new heightened attention to close reading. The students would have to go back over and over that little snippet of text to discover that it's about London and about the plague. And then they can launch their research from there. Hopefully, this will help them think in terms of question asking, some inquiry-based analysis, where they would be asking themselves, okay, plague in London, when would that have taken place? Again, how many people would have died? What are these pits? How did the burial of the dead take place? So they start to form some hopefully very interesting questions. And then again, by searching around on the internet, they'll hopefully have some new interest in using the internet to find high-quality primary sources, not just SparkNotes on the internet. And you'll see in a later slide, I even reference SparkNotes as something that they can play around with as part of this type of research. But hopefully they'll want to do more than SparkNotes and look at these really high-quality resources put up by some place like Harvard. Okay, so this engagement with older literature, I would like to emphasize that what I do in exercises like the one I was just showing you is aim for a process of engagement where we are highlighting critical thinking skills that can be enacted by old literature. And that the older literature can actually really show off those critical thinking skills. So I've put down here in these bullets some of the more advanced thinking that can come into play when students are doing more of this open-ended type of research on the internet. You can see that I think older literature can be used to trigger curiosity and to help them to understand that this literature is fascinating, precisely because it offers a new window onto this older cultural context. Also, this work enacts a process of inquiry leading to discovery. This is at the heart of critical thinking. Students can learn to engage in meaningful question asking, that they can see how those questions can start to lead them to discover new materials. If they ask good questions, they can use those questions to type in good keywords that will lead to good, high-quality material. So by purposely not telling them that this is Daniel Defoe's plague year, by forcing them to play around with different keywords, they'll start to discover material about the plague rather than just pulling up, again, SparkNote summaries of Journal of the Plague Year. Okay? So that process of kind of good question asking can lead to discovery. As I've just mentioned, all of this should lead to honing their close reading skills. Hopefully there's a little bit of excitement built into this because they're looking for clues as they're trying to figure out what is this text and what is it about. And then, as the last point, something that could really be built into something that was a more lengthier research process, but even a short exercise can get them to engage in some preliminary interpretation formation, where they can be starting to ask research-type questions, and they can start to form some preliminary interpretations. And I think this is at the heart of really almost any literature classroom, any literature paper that students are writing, but they can start to do this in an exciting way for older material if that material is presented in some experiential sort of hands-on ways. So I'm going to emphasize through a series of examples that we will get to in just another slide or two, my approach to older texts is to try to insert some exciting exercises that are very materials rich. So I'm emphasizing this materials rich approach to older texts to emphasize the idea of primary sources, to emphasize cultural and historical context, and to emphasize literary history. And I just feel as though I needed to note that this is really indebted to the academic database revolution that's happening now, where high-quality material is available on databases like ECHO, 18th Century Collections Online, or EBO, Early English Books Online. Also, scholars are producing just amazing websites filled with high-quality materials. That Harvard Contagion site is a good example. All of that's becoming accessible. Students often don't find that stuff immediately because the way they're searching the internet will return, again, SparkNote-type versions, and they don't know to dig a bit deeper to find the higher quality material being put up by universities and museums. And of course, this is really indebted to history of the book and cultural studies types approaches. In addition to thinking of approaching older literature in a materials-rich way, I would like to emphasize approaching it in a very active, experiential, collaborative learning way, where I want to encourage you to think about positioning older literature in a way that at first might seem a bit counterintuitive. I think often when we're giving students some older literature, we feel that we must give them a lot of background information and maybe give them a little lecture, give them a lot of maybe background readings to help them understand, say, oh, what would the British Renaissance be about before we give them, say, a sonnet sequence by Shakespeare or Spenser. However, I'm going to say, what if we imagined not giving them the material in that form, but giving it to them in a more experiential form, in a more active learning form, like we were just doing with the plague, where they would have to engage in some open-ended exploration, where the information is not given to them, but they must find it themselves. And there's an emphasis on inquiry, on questioning, that they must form their own questions. What do they want to know about this material? And then also an emphasis on connecting texts. How do you take a primary literary source and embed it in its context? What type of synthesis can you engage in when you're connecting an individual text to a rich array of contextual primary sources? I like to create lots of short, low-stakes exercises so that students don't just think of research as being connected to a major research paper that's worth a lot of their grade. Rather, a short, low-stakes overnight exercise here. I've given you this text. We've just discovered it's about the plague. We've done some preliminary question formation. Now go home and for next class, come in with some of the source material you can find. So low stakes to get them excited and to allow for them to make some mistakes, allow for them to engage in some sharing and collaboration as they find the material together. So again, this is a bit of a reversal of a top-down lecture or a head note type approach to a historical background for these literary sources. And again, I am saying we'll embrace the internet, but hopefully not in the way our students typically will use it, which is in a very quick way, only looking for materials that come up right at the top of their keyword search. I think that we can also, as the last bullet on this slide, get students to engage in a bit of conversation in the class about what does make good research on the internet. Sort of, how did you find that? How did you know that this was a good source? Well, if it was put up by Harvard, it obviously must be high quality and reliable. Okay, so I think the last thing I would like to emphasize before turning to some more examples is that this type of thinking about working with older literature has actually helped me to clarify for myself what I'm terming a literary method. So I've realized by doing this type of open-ended, inquiry-based research with my students, it's clarified for me the type of literary method I want them to think about whenever they're approaching a piece of literature. So students are very familiar with the scientific method of sort of formulating a hypothesis and testing it. But they don't quite have an idea of what a literary method would be to partner with that scientific method. But through this type of work, I myself have come up with my little mini literary method that I sort of trot out to students as a good way to think about what are the skills you're learning whenever you approach any piece of literature, and particularly an older piece of literature. So you can see I've bulleted these out. I tell students literature really encourages you to enter into a new world with your mind, your eyes, your ears open. And then I tell them you have to engage in this process of close reading. Close observation is key to what they're learning in their literature classes. They have to learn to create questions. Here's that inquiry-based thinking. And then they must read again. They must go back and do this reiterative process of rethinking their initial reading and develop interpretations. So read again thinking inwards to literary theme and form and structure, and then thinking outwards to cultural contexts, or if they're in a literary theory class, it might mean to theoretical texts. Read aloud. Don't just read silently. And this should all help you, student, to form meaning, form your own interpretations, but also at the same time maintain openness because other students in the class might be forming different meanings from what you've formed. So this process has actually very much helped me to create sort of an overarching sense of what our literary method is. Okay, so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk walking you through different approaches and exercises. I've got 5 different approaches, and we've already done the first one. So I'll be showing you the other 4. The first approach is the mystery text approach, where I've given students text without telling them what it is and saying, you need to figure out what this text is. You need to figure out the themes, the topic, the author, the time period. Working sort of backwards, not giving them the background information, but making them come up with it. After we move forward into the next approaches, you'll see I emphasize illustrating the text, editing the text, interviewing the author, and surrounding the text as my other sort of 4 approaches. I'll show you lots of exercises for each of these. And what I'll do is there's a screen that will show you a lot of text and then some clippings that I've found as part of the way that students might do the assignment themselves. So I'll show you the examples and sort of talk you through the assignment as we go. So we'll look at illustrating the text first. You can see I've got some Blake and Rossetti that I'll be looking at for that. We'll look at editing the text. We'll look at Whitman and Shakespeare. We'll talk about interviewing the author with Gwendolyn Brooks and Hawthorne. And then surrounding the text, we'll go to some collections that are particularly rich, the British Library, and then a collection of different institutions, the Mass Historical Society, University of North Carolina, and the Library of Congress. So we've done our mystery text with the Journal of the Plague Year. And you can see that I've jotted down the way I would walk students through the assignment. And I'm putting this up here so that, again, if you want to refer to this talk, you will have sort of the assignment for every single example that I'm about to give you. You can go back in and see the exact bullets. I personally, again, like to give students a lot of leeway with very little guidance at the beginning and tell them that that's the fun of this type of exercise, that it is a mystery and they have to solve the mystery. I encourage them to work in partners or pairs, and I encourage them to generate the types of questions they want to answer. Maybe do that in class and then go home and find those answers and bring them back in. And the last bullet on this page is I do often limit them to specific websites. I say you can only find information at museums and university websites. So let's go to our second example, which I'm calling Illustrate the Text. And we'll look at Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience using a wonderful website, the Blake Archive. It's pulled together by the Library of Congress and University of North Carolina. And you can see for each of these examples I'm going to give you, I give you the source that's sort of there in orange, and then I give you the assignment. So let me briefly tell you the assignment and then show it to you as I talk you through these points. Basically, the Blake Archive allows students to look at the many different versions of Blake's hand-colored, illuminated pages of Songs of Innocence and Experience. So this is an exercise asking them to think about how they use those illustrations of the text. So let me just show you this and talk you through the assignment. What I would do is have students randomly be assigned a Blake poem. Let's just say you were the student that got the Sick Rose, the poem that's before us. I would say to the student, you must now go to blakearchive.org, show them how it works a little bit. It's very, very user-friendly and easy to use. Each student would pull up their poem. So for the Sick Rose, they pull up their poem, and they can see on this archive the 13 different versions of the poem. Each version is hand-colored in a different way. And then I would ask the student, you must pick 2 different illuminations that you like for your poem. But hopefully you'll pick ones that are somewhat different, that allow you to think about how the illustrations or the coloring of the poem changes the feel of the poem, changes your interpretation of the poem. So students would just be randomly given a poem and said, go on to the archive. You must pick your 2 favorite illuminated versions and be ready to come back to class, pull them up, and explain how these different versions make them feel for the poem in different ways. So the questions would be things like, how does Blake's coloring and shading and additions to the image set the tone of the poem? What words in the poem seem to be emphasized by the different versions? So that, again, they have to do close reading, but maybe it's more a deeper form of close reading because they have to be looking very, very carefully at these images and their coloring. For example, in this first image here of the Sick Rose, you can see it's a red rose. And that helps to play up Blake's word crimson joy that's in that poem. But he made the choice in the second image of the sick rose not to use the color crimson, which is quite interesting, I think. So let me give you another example of an illustrate the text. And this is a very fun exercise to do that I've had great success with, and I'm going to show you several different examples. But it has a very clear, sort of very obvious. I give students a Christina Rossetti poem, sort of randomly, and I tell them that they must locate a pre-Raphaelite painting that seems to illustrate their selected poem. And then ask them questions very similar to the Blake of how does that image help you to interpret the poem? What words in the poem sort of come to life when they're put side by side with this illustration? And of course, then we would move towards maybe a later class that would talk about how Rossetti's part of the sort of pre-Raphaelite time period and give them more historical background. But to start, again, I want them to be thinking of what sort of issues fascinate them as students, what sort of connections are they created in this open-ended way. At the very end, students can bring in their images that they can find online and sort of create an art exhibit out of the selections by projecting them in the class or creating, just as I've done here, creating slides. Each student could just create one slide, and bingo, you have an entire slideshow of illustrated poems. So here's a very obvious example, probably the most well-known pre-Raphaelite painting, which is Millet's of Ophelia, an illustration of Hamlet. But you can imagine a student connecting this to Christina Rossetti's poem, Sleeping at Last, because it's about death. And actually in the last stanza, it talks about death along with purple thyme and purple clover, the image of a woman dying, sleeping at last, but having these flowers along with her. So you can imagine a student putting these two side by side. I've done this myself, and I've told students you cannot use the Ophelia image. It's too well known. I've used this as the example. And then students can find alternative illustrations, maybe for the same poem even. So a student brought in this as her illustration for the same exact poem and found this at the Birmingham Art Museum. Again, I had kind of limited them to a certain number of websites, and they were museum websites. And the student selected this image because of the way this drawing, the woman's hands are all sort of gripped under her neck, and it seemed to be capturing the phrasing in the poem. If you look in the second stanza, there's a word ring, pangs that ring. And then the last line in that stanza is dreamless sleep locked fast. And the student did a great job of saying how this image helped her to see that idea of ringing or locking fast because of the way the hands were shaped in this image. So that's just a good example of illustrating the poem can help the students close read that poem much more carefully. And I'll mention that this is a Dante Rossetti image. So, you know, we could talk a bit about Dante Rossetti and Christina Rossetti in a future class. And then here's just one more example. This is a love poem, not a death poem, to mix it up a little. And here's an image, a Ford Maddox Ford image of Romeo and Juliet. So students sometimes get a kick out of the pre-Raphaelites using literature as their inspiration and then applying that literary image to a different piece of literature that it wasn't meant for. But this image is about love, and we've got a great image of love here. The poem starts by saying that maybe the lover, the man, loves the woman more strongly than she does him. And this painting seems to sort of capture that maybe the man is the more passionate one in this image. So that's illustrating the text. The idea, again, of sending the students out to do a little bit of their own open-ended inquiry, to find a cultural context here. The pre-Raphaelites is a context for Christina Rossetti. They can find lots of great material in a very quick and loose way, and hopefully have a lot of excitement and curiosity that spurs on more research so that they want to know more about the Rossettis, more about pre-Raphaelites. Okay, so let's move on to another example, which I call edit the text. This, again, as soon as you see it, it will be very, very obvious. I give students manuscript materials that come right off the internet, or early editions, say a 17th century edition of Shakespeare sonnets, which I'll show you, and I ask them to be the editor, for them to transcribe down the material and then maybe even footnote the material, so that they have to wrestle with the text in this very close reading way, and they have to make meaning out of the text themselves. So I often do this in quite a random way, where I'll download material or even just print it right off the website, or tell them where to go and give them the URLs, randomly assigned. The students then are given instructions that what they have to do is simply try to transcribe it and make it look like the final version of the poem. I will often do this in class. It doesn't take much longer than a class period, so that they're not tempted to go to their anthology or to go online and see how a professional has transcribed it. At the end, you can reveal sort of the professional transcription or transliteration. And you can see some of the questions I ask them. As I ask them, what do you see about the writing process when you look at a manuscript piece? What do you learn about the poem? What ideas seem to be being emphasized by the process you can see on the page? So let's look at a Whitman piece of manuscript. So you can see how rich and interesting this is for students to look at, that it doesn't easily transcribe. You can see a sample rewriting at the bottom of the screen. And Microsoft Word won't even let you capture all of the crossouts and caret marks and doubly raised up words. It can't even be completely put into type. But students have a lot of fun with just a short little piece like this, thinking about the writing process that's captured on the page. And it gives them, I think, a newfound respect for how carefully different words in, say, a piece of poetry are selected by the author. So I'll give you another example, which is a Shakespeare sonnet. And this is in print. So it does allow the students to see something that they think at first will be easy to work with. But very quickly, when they look at the sonnet, they realize, oh, it's using these strange typeface forms. The S's look like F's, and the U's look like V's. They're, often flummoxed by that for a minute, and then they start to figure it out. They also see very quickly that the writing in the sonnet, this is the first edition of the published sonnets, they see that there's lots of errors, and they take great delight in that something as well known as a Shakespeare sonnet existed sort of in an imperfect form when it was first printed. So you can see the first line, "Then let not winter's ragged hand deface." And very quickly they realize, oh, ragged is sort of misspelled. What's that W in front of it? And so I've highlighted it in the red. And winter's, it should have an apostrophe in there. It's winter's ragged hand. Where's the possessive? So very quickly they can start the process of editing. And then you can see in blue I've put down some footnotes. So part of this assignment could be having them think about how they would transcribe the sonnet, correct it, and footnote some of the words they're unsure of or some of the changes they're making. So in the fourth line, there's a typo. It says bow tits instead of beauties. So again, students, I think, would find that fascinating and have to think, what did that word bow tits really mean? Oh, it must have meant beauties. It must just be a typo. And you can see how it's footnoted at the bottom. So right before this slide, I put in a slide that tells you where to find the sonnet. It's on a great Internet Shakespeare edition website put up by the University of Victoria. And again, would just give these students each individually a sonnet and ask them, what's unclear about the sonnet? Highlight those errors. What words do you not know? And go ahead and get to work. Start editing it, transcribe it, kind of put some footnotes in. So as another example of another kind of hands-on experience experiential approach is what I would call interview the author. So for this, I've been thinking quite a bit lately about how a relatively new development on the internet is the increasing use of audio. So I would like to encourage you to think about, could students use the audio that's increasingly being uploaded to listen, obviously listen to poets reading out loud, something like Gwendolyn Brooks reading her own poetry. There's also many lectures by her online. They could listen to some of those. I've put a few of them up on the screen. But then have the students themselves take on this idea of interviewing the author, where they'd work in pairs, and one student would be the author. The author would read the poem and be ready to answer some questions. The other student would be the interviewer and would have to introduce the author, give a little précis about the author's life or the author's works, and then ask the questions. Now, they would work in pairs to create this little pre-written interview, but that process of working together to come up with how would I introduce an author, what questions would I ask of the author, how would the author answer those questions, you can see how that would require quite a lot of work. And again, it's very open-ended. They're finding that material on their own. They would have to be doing some of that heavy lifting of figuring out how they could condense an author's life and works into a short little introduction, do maybe a dramatic reading, and then answer questions about it. So going online, you can see there are many, many sources that have audio embedded. This is just from poetryfoundation.org, a very well-known site, and it has Gwendolyn Brooks. You can see the little audio image under the title Kitchenette Building. It has her reading Kitchenette Building. So students could listen to that and then maybe have to read it themselves and think of if they would follow the same way that Gwendolyn Brooks read her own poem, or if they would try to emphasize different words. And you can see some of the types of questions that students might ask back and forth. I've put up some samples that they themselves could use to trigger new ideas. As another example, I've put up Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne, we don't have any recordings of him reading his short stories, so they can't quite do that. But I've used a version of this with students where I've had them look at what SparkNotes puts up about Hawthorne. And I've said, imagine you interviewing Hawthorne and saying, this is what SparkNotes thinks you're saying in your text. Is this true, Nathaniel? So you can imagine a bit of an interview going back and forth with Nathaniel Hawthorne, asking him, do we have it right? Do we understand young Goodman Brown? Are we correct in the way that now this has become kind of the standard interpretation of your story? So you can see sort of SparkNotes is up there, and it emphasizes the weakness of public morality. So I think you could have students even interview, very old authors, very old and dusty, but imagine using some of the materials that we try to warn them away from as a source of some good interview questions. Okay, so I want to move to the last exercise as we move towards wrapping up. This is working with collections that are particularly rich, moving towards source material based on the collecting institution and realizing that some institutions have very, very strong digital collections. So this frame is putting up the British Library, working from the British Library first and seeing what they have and sort of generating exercises based on that. And I'm calling this Surround the Text. It would be very similar to what we opened up with Defoe and surrounding Journal of the Plague Year with plague materials. So with the British Library, they have wonderful materials that I've listed down here with these bullets: language and literature, turning the pages where they show virtual books where you can turn the pages, literary landscapes, and treasures in full. So I would use this material, for example, to create an assignment around mapping Chaucer's world. We've looked at some of the maps that they put right up for Chaucer so that students can start to imagine the world of Chaucer. So these are some of the materials. I've just taken some screenshots right off of sites from the British Library that you can imagine surrounding Chaucer with this information. I'll give you one last example as we then move to conclude of surrounding the text. This would be Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And there's a wealth of material out there about slavery and slave narratives. And I've put a few down here. All of these contain primary source materials that you could almost assign individual groups of students one website to look at. Or you could give them a list of texts and give each student an individual text that they must summarize and bring into class. And before you know it, in class, bingo, you have the text, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, surrounded by all this contextual material. You could emphasize slavery debates or the form of slave narratives through these wonderful resources. Let me just show them to you. There's a lot of abolitionist material in this great website documenting the American South, the second image on the screen. There's lots of slave narratives. Every student almost could have their own unique slave narrative to look at. And then I would like to emphasize at the bottom of the page, some of you might have heard of this, but there was a federal writers project in the 1930s that interviewed ex-slaves. So they have interviews of living ex-slaves that they wrote down those interviews, which you can download very easily. You could imagine each student getting a different interview with an ex-slave remembering his or her life as a slave and comparing that to Douglass. So I think we should end by just reminding ourselves of why we would do any of this. I hope that just by giving you a lot of examples of illustrating the text, surrounding the text, interviewing authors, that you can see that a materials-rich, sort of digital and visually rich approach to literature might encourage students to have those sparks of curiosity. I'm very much emphasizing active learning and exploratory learning, wanting students to think in more open-ended and creative ways. And I think some of those elements are a bit intangible. How do we capture curiosity or excitement or aesthetic appreciation in the classroom? But that's, again, where I'm hoping that some of these exercises can actually do that and use old literature, the literature that students often think of as a bit dusty, to do that. Again, this enacts the process of inquiry moving to discovery. And for myself, it actually helped me to clarify my own literary method. So we've looked at these 5 different types of examples of ways to do this type of work in the classroom. The mystery text example, illustrate the text, edit the text, interview the author, and then surround the text. Hopefully you can find one of those that might work with one of your favorite texts that you've assigned in a class. And maybe by thinking about this, you can find some of your favorite online materials to bring into the classroom. I thought I would end just by showing you some of my favorites, just to keep that sense of curiosity and excitement going amongst ourselves. These are some of my favorites that you can find Alice in Wonderland in a turn-the-page manuscript at the British Library. You can find actual documents relating to the Salem witch trials, the actual records from the trials. And then you can find all of Emily Dickinson's manuscript poems have been put up by Harvard. So those are some of my favorites that I didn't get a chance to show off earlier. But I think once you find a favorite, you can't help but bring it into the classroom. And I'm hoping create sort of an open-ended, experiential way for students to enjoy it. So I'd like to just end with that and thank you. Feel free to contact me with any questions or suggestions. And I know we have a few minutes left maybe for a question or two as we wrap up.
Cheryl, thank you so much. I just so enjoyed your presentation. I've taken like 2 pages of notes, even though I know that I can look back at the PowerPoint slides. So I wanted to first, observe, I guess, that, a couple slides ago you asked, why would why do we do all this? What are some of the, purposes behind engaging this kind of these kind of practices? And I would propose that there's even another answer that, we're sort of living in this. I know it's not a new battle, but the embattled humanities in the STEM culture. And I was thinking, as you were talking earlier, at the very beginning, I was thinking of the report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Heart of the Matter, that talks about why it's important to keep these to keep the humanities alive for students. And I was struck by the ways in which all of these activities are really connecting students to processes and habits of mind that are so much broader than any one discipline.
Right.
And I
think that in a way, the materials that students might at first be resistant to the most, like, oh, I have to look at Chaucer or a Shakespeare sonnet. I remember that vaguely from another class, and I didn't enjoy that right off the bat. I think that that sort of like resistance is what I'm trying to break through, but I think it's just what you're saying, that kind of sense of breaking through this resistance to the idea that any form of literary study, oh, how can that be relevant? How can that be connected into this idea of getting excited about research? I think that obviously, I think that it's all crucial to getting students excited about research, that the older material, precisely because it does open up this window to this other world, and there's now, thanks to all of these scholars putting material up, there's all this rich contextual material. Students really can, I hope, get turned on in a way that gets them excited about it. And then I hope they get to see, oh, this is building really essential skills. This is these very crucial skills of how do I ask good questions, how do I formulate potential answers, how do I go out and do more research to check those answers, how do I know what a good source is versus a bad source? Again, SparkNotes versus the British Library, right? I think all of that are the type of skills that they'll need, and they won't. I don't think that they would get potentially in a STEM course. So again, hopefully this will be almost making quite visible, making very apparent and kind of transparent to students that this type of research matters, and it's giving essential skills.
Well, and I noticed that even the language that you're using to describe some of the assignments, is I've been thinking a lot about what helps students with transferable skills. I think everybody thinks about that, but I think about sometimes the way that our discipline and others have some esoteric vocabularies that students may not know, that there's a relationship between the literary method and the scientific method, or that research in this discipline is a skill set that they could apply wholesale. That this whole idea of looking for clues, like I love this idea of the mystery text, that it because for our students, I think a lot of texts are a mystery. Even if a head note is provided, the likelihood that they've read it carefully or looked at the timeline, and I think that probably is true, across the board, that that they kind of dive in, so they're awash in mystery for much longer than they need to be, much of the time.
Right. Well, and I think that that's where, for us, it's we are so used to the material that we've forgotten that sense of mystery that many of our students might feel. But I guess what I'm trying to do is harness a little bit of that kind of, and get them to that moment of that initial, like, oh, what is this? And trying to heighten that with a sense of curiosity, whether that be by encouraging them to look at paintings, or whether to show them an actual manuscript, what an author's handwriting looks like. Any of that, I think, can go a long ways towards getting students to get that little bit of excitement going, and for them to say, oh, okay, I do want to know more, and then letting them feel like they can start to figure this out. They can ask the right type of questions and start to formulate answers. They don't have to just rely on, you know, my summary or the summary, again, that might be at the front of their textbook. They can go out and find some of this on their own. So.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's so interesting the way you've kind of like suggested this kind of curated collection of digital resources to sort of combat that. It's all out there, but where do I start? You know, I mean, the kind of the mysteries of uncertainty that are created by, you know, being bombarded with information. Right. But I notice how many, you know, of your assignments are about, you know, kind of curating that and giving them some direction so that they're engaged in that process of discovery, but you're not letting them just head off into the woods. See, now I'm stuck in the Young Goodman Brown kind of in the woods are feeling scary. But we have a question here from Brenna Dugan, and she's wondering about kind of the real world, not virtual world connections here. And she says, you know, how does your Boston location influence your teaching with the many early American writers geographically relevant to your campus? Do you feel like your students benefit from that as well?
Oh, definitely. And that's actually where some of this started, was that we're very fortunate to be only a T-ride away from the Boston Public Library, where I brought students in and they can look at some manuscripts right there. They can see they've got some Hawthorne manuscripts and some Poe manuscripts. So had a great little session with students, having them look at some manuscript material. And students got so excited by that immediacy of the rare book room and the manuscript text. And I myself wasn't sure exactly what they would be looking at that day. That's where it was a bit of a mystery text for me too. We had pulled up folders, but I wasn't sure exactly what would be in these different letters and things like that we looked at. And so the students really got fascinated by seeing the actual material and then also feeling like they could have some ownership over it, that it wasn't me telling them, look at this letter and you can see this topic. I had to say, read that letter closely and then tell the rest of the class, what are you seeing in it? And that was such a success that it made me realize that maybe the best way into this older material is to try to get them close to the primary source, even if we can't bring them all the time into a rare books library. Now the rare books library is completely accessible online. And to allow them to start to use that like detective-like skill where they have to start to uncover some meaning themselves. And so, again, let them ask the questions. Even if they don't know the answers, they can often start to ask really good questions. Get them to start to think. And often if they're working in pairs or small groups, they can get quite far in terms of knowing the types of issues that they want to explore around a text. And so all of that came together by virtue of being in Boston and having some of the material right there. So that was, you know, fantastic. And then the only other thing I would say is that we've done some classes where we bring students actually to the sites of different literary sites and spaces. And so, for example, we've read Walden and gone to Walden Pond. And that always makes such a huge impression on students.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, that would be the ideal, is if there was some way to embed an experience like that into a classroom. That would just be fantastic. I know that's not possible for many, you know, classes to do, but I do think that makes a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I like how, I mean, so many of your assignments, you can see that, you know, there's a very real motive for collaboration. You know, you brought up earlier this kind of idea of having students work in pairs with the manuscripts. And in some way, it strikes me that the way you have that kind of set up, there's a real-world, you know, component to even virtual exploration, in that those students are engaged in kind of a journey of discovery together, and that's very different than the way we utilize collaborative assignments in class a lot of times. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of times it's more task-based, so students figure out that group work is really something they can parse out, and collaboration becomes just effective project management instead of, being engaged together in a journey. And I think all of this, so much of what you have set up here, because it encourages contact with the primary source and deeper levels of engagement and these kinds of, discovery moments. It really positions students to work together, like folks on a journey instead of, project managers in a cubicle, kind of.
Right, and I think that even to think back to your opening question about STEM, I think that we have this image of, in different disciplines, students can work together in a lab. They are used to the idea of collaborative research in a lab-type setting. And I think that, again, our own research is often very, solitary, where we are working with our books, alone in our study. But I wanted to think of, we can answer that image of the laboratory by creating little spaces in class to get students to work collaboratively and think of these rare materials as sort of the raw stuff that they can explore. And again, I think it's sort of just inverting some of the assumptions that we have about how research should work and what source material looks like. And I've done exercises like this with freshmen where they really do not have to have a lot of background information. And as long as I'm not building this up into being their big research project, as long as I've created the space in the syllabus for this is just exploratory. This is just to see what types of things we can find on our own. It can be built later into something that's much more sort of intensive and rigorous. But I think for the opening, it's often great to have students feel like they have a little space of exploration where anything goes. And that they can use sort of their facility of searching around, say, on the Internet to bring back good information, to show off. And they're, often even just saying, like, I want everybody in the class to create one PowerPoint slide. You're finding one image, cut and paste it right onto your PowerPoint slide, sort of just showing them one example and saying, go do it. They're often amazed at how much they can do in, again, like one class or one overnight quick exercise. So I even like the idea of sort of, low stakes, sort of purposely preliminary type approaches. Again, more to spark that curiosity and excitement about older literature, as a way to break through that kind of resistance to literature. That they might say, like, oh, why do I have to, again, study something that seems to be so old? Yeah.
Wow. Well, these were all just so great. I could talk with you forever. We're 10 minutes over time though, so we should probably wrap up before we get kicked off this line. But thank you again, Cheryl, and for those on the listening in, we're going to post the recording of this, and Cheryl's going to send us her PowerPoints in case you want to download those and use some of her ideas in class right away. So thanks everyone for being here, and thank you, Cheryl, for these amazing, great ideas.
Yeah, thank you. And I just would say that in the PowerPoints themselves, I know some of it we have to move through fairly quickly, but there are all of the website addresses of everything I was showing us right there, and the assignments themselves are sort of bulleted out, so you can get a sense of maybe what were some of the ways that this operated, in real time. So again, I hope this just has triggered some new thinking on everyone's part to take what's helpful and maybe come up with new, exciting new exercises that are different from these too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.